Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Professor James Lowenberg-DeBoer. Mixed cropping can provide valuable benefits to farmers, improving soil health, reducing pest pressures and fertilizer use, and increasing production. However, the high labor costs required to manage mixed cropping systems can prevent farmers from reaping these benefits. In this episode, James joins me to discuss how autonomous machines can help farmers get those advantages without higher labor costs. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. Today we have James Lowenberg-DeBoer with us. James grew up on a farm in northwest Iowa and farmed there in the 1970s. He found opportunities to do research and has focused his work on the economics of new technology in agriculture, first at Purdue University and since 2018 at Harper Adams University in the United Kingdom, where he works mostly on the economics of crop robotics. Hello, James. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Great to be here.
We are so happy to have you. So, as your bio might have suggested, we are going to be talking about kind of the interlocking of economics and robotics today. So, to get us started, can you just provide a bit of an overview on the problem that your research was hoping to address?
So one of the challenges, or really the biggest challenge of agriculture in the 21st century, is how to feed the world's population while enhancing the environment, making it better than it was before. One of the ways of doing that is in terms of crop choice, in terms of mixing crops in fields, because there's often positive interactions between certain crops. The problem is that when crops are mixed in fields, this creates extra work. And it's common in manual agriculture where things are done by hand, because hoeing around one plant or another doesn't create a big problem. When agriculture is mechanized, it usually disappears almost immediately. And one of the challenges here is to think about, okay, if we want to reintroduce some of this mixed cropping, how do we deal with the labor issues? One of the opportunities there is to use autonomous machines, or robots as they're commonly called, to help deal with some of the labor issues. And so this study, the work we did, looked at what is the economics of doing strip cropping, which is the simplest form of mixed cropping, with autonomous machines.
Sure. Yeah. And just strip cropping is just kind of stripes, basically, of one crop and then another, covering our bases on the terms here. Speaking of which, there are many to kind of look at here. So the first one, which is going to come up soon, is linear programming. So can you just talk about a little what that means?
Most people, linear programming is essentially automated budgeting. And if you have 3 or 4 budgets to compare, you can do that in a spreadsheet, and farmers do that all the time. If you have literally thousands of alternatives with different plant and harvest times and different machines, then the comparisons get very much more complicated. And using linear programming is a way to sort through all those opportunities very quickly. And the particular version that we're using is based on the Purdue Crop and Livestock linear programming model, which was developed several decades ago. And I used to run a workshop at Purdue in which farmers came in and modeled their own farm. And they were making decisions about switching to no-till or doing other kinds of new machines. And many of them actually came back to me later and said that those analyses were particularly valuable for them and helped lay the basis for their success as farmers. So I have a lot of confidence in this particular model. And so we've adapted this to the situation, autonomous machines, which means that you have not only human labor time that needs to be tracked, you also have the robot labor.
Thank you. That is super helpful. So we have this modeling program to look at different aspects of these techniques, and then partly for my own benefit, as these usually are, I am hoping you can kind of define within this project how you are kind of defining conventional agriculture, the autonomous system, hybrid systems. And then I'm also going to throw in swarm robotics, partly because it's a very cool term, but also it will come up later.
So conventional agriculture is, for the purposes of the study, we've defined it that using large-scale motorized machines, so that you would typically find in Midwestern farms, using fertilizers and herbicides and the kinds of hybrids and seeds that are typically used. So all of those are there. When you introduce strip cropping, and strip cropping is possible with conventional machines, and it's actually not that unusual. You see a bit of strip cropping some places in the U.S. for soil conservation reasons, say in southern Wisconsin and so on rolling landscapes. And you often see it in the Midwest when corn prices are quite high because it gives an advantage to corn production. Farmers usually give it up very quickly because of the labor issues when you're doing it with conventional machines. But when you do it with conventional machines, you need to use smaller equipment because there's an advantage on having narrower strips. And so the analysis that we did, we used six row, 30-inch row equipment, which was about the smallest equipment that we could get good prices on anymore. And the other scenario that we looked at was making that smaller equipment autonomous. And autonomy is a continuum. So we can have some very limited autonomy where there's a human being that's in the field and watching the machine all of the time and interacting with it very commonly. And this is actually something that happens or is used in, say, horticultural production very commonly. At the other end of the spectrum, we can have an autonomous machine that works by itself most of the time, and then the human operator, which is needed for legal and liability reasons, but the human operator gets a text message if something goes wrong. So, and everywhere in between there. So we're thinking sort of at the ends of that spectrum. So we have the conventional equipment, which has a human being in the driver's seat, and we have an autonomous machine where the human is now in contact and is spending maybe 10% of the human's time on managing the machine, because there's always certain things that happen that the machine can't deal with. And most of the autonomous machines that are on the market these days are not very smart, that the AI for obstacle management and so on has not really been developed very much. So if something happens, usually the machine stops and waits for the human to come and solve it. So we're assuming that about 10% of the human's time is needed there. So there still is some human time needed. So we have really three scenarios, baseline scenarios. Conventional farming with large machines, whole fields. We have strip cropping, and in this case, corn and soybeans, with conventional, relatively modest size machines. And then those same machines, now the 6-row, 30-inch row machines that are autonomous. They've been retrofitted with software and hardware for autonomy.
On your autonomous group, are you assuming more on the send me a text if something goes wrong level? Is that what you were kind of testing for?
So the autonomy assumes that there's a human that's paying attention, and a human gets an alert if something goes wrong, and then the human operator needs to come. And this is legal in most of the United States. So that's why we assume that would be that way. There are some legal restrictions in the state of California, but of course this study is done in Indiana, and so it's not an issue. It's also, there's some restrictions in the European Union. So, and we're based on the experience that we've had at Harper Adams University, where we've been growing crops entirely with robots since 2016. And so we have some experience with this, and this is where the 10% comes from.
Sure. And I'm assuming that's 10% of what would be like their usual labor costs, not like 24 hours a day, 10%.
Well, it's 10% of so if you think about the time that the autonomous machine is out in the field, say the autonomous machine needs 6 hours to do this particular field operation, then 10% of that time would be required for the human supervision.
Okay, so it's based off of the robot time. Good to know. And then I'm assuming, just to round out these definitions, that hybrid would just be naturally somewhere in between those two poles. And then swarm robotics is like a bunch of robots, right?
Okay.
Right?
So in the world of robotics, a hybrid robot is one that can be used either manually or can have an autonomous setting. And so the retrofitted machines have an advantage because they typically have a switch. They still have a seat and a steering wheel. And so they have a switch that can switch between manual and autonomous. And this is incredibly helpful in moving robots from field to field. The other end of the spectrum there are the robots that come from the manufacturer as robots. They don't have a seat, they don't have a steering wheel. And in order to move them from field to field, they need to be put on a trailer and driven to the next field. Whereas with the hybrid machines, you flip the switch, the human gets on, drives them to the next field, and then flips the switch again and sets them off in autonomous mode.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
And to answer your other question, the swarm robots is the idea that once the human being is no longer on the tractor, the reasons for having very, very large equipment almost disappear. And so there's the idea that you could have many smaller machines that could do the same jobs as a large machine. And that has many advantages in the sense that the smaller machines are lighter, they don't cause as much soil compaction. If you have a breakdown, maybe just one of those small machines breaks down and the rest of them can go up and do their work. So there's many advantages in doing that. We don't know what the ideal size of those small machines are. So in this case, we're just using those 6-row, 50 horsepower, roughly, tractors to mimic the effect of that swarm robot scenario.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad that you clarified on the size, because for me, when I think, because I'm plot twist for listeners, hopefully not, I'm not a farmer. So the scale that you're operating at is something that is not always easy. I mean, obviously, there's also a huge spectrum of the size of farms depending on where you are. So it's helpful to know, if we're talking about slightly larger than a Roomba or like a lawnmower versus, a tractor. So I appreciate you setting the stage. And I think you just answered this. How many are in a swarm? Was it 5? Am I making that up?
The swarm depends on the job you have to do. So instead of the conventional approach would be you have a bigger farm, you need bigger machines, right? With swarm technology, if you have a bigger farm, you have more robots. So a small farm might have 1 robot, and a medium-sized farm might have 10, and a very, very large farm might have 100 robots, all doing the same job.
Okay. I think that's a helpful thing to kind of frame this issue, especially when we're talking about costs to, the farmer of needing to own a certain number of, tractor-sized things. So I think that sets the stage well of kind of what we're looking at. So you've got these 3 different kind of scenarios that you were plugging into your linear programming. So tell me a little bit more about what that process looks like. What specific, obviously we've talked about some of the factors that you're testing, but what was kind of set as a control, what wasn't, and then how you kind of process this information would be great.
So the linear programming requires the same sort of information that you would use in budgeting. So you need to know what your inputs are, your feed and fertilizer and pesticides, You need to know how much time is going to be devoted to certain tasks, which tasks you need to do, and how much time does each one take. You need to know, okay, if you do this with a big machine, how much time for the machine and for the human does it take? If you do it with a small machine that's conventional, how much time for the human? And then for the autonomous, how much time do you need for both the human and the machine? So you need that kind of information. You structure that, and the way that the linear program is structured is that it's put into spreadsheets. And those are then uploaded. Once you get it all set up, you set it running, and it comes out with a result, and it tells you what the crop choice and planting and harvest times and so on that would be most profitable.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? James's paper, Economics of Strip Cropping with Autonomous Machines, published in Agronomy Journal, is always freely available. If you are a certified crop advisor or certified professional soil scientist, you can take a quiz for continuing education units for this episode, which can be found in our show notes or on certifiedcropadvisor.org. Let's get back to the show. Awesome. Yeah, super helpful. So, yeah, I mean, that seems, well, I don't want to say straightforward because I feel like nothing in modeling ever seems straightforward to me. But it seems like you've got a lot of experience working with this. So, yeah, what did you find? Also, can you tell us what size farm you were looking at here? I'm not sure if we mentioned that already.
We used a 5,330 acre farm. And that number was chosen because there was a previous study which used entirely just conventional equipment, and we were building their study. So this would be not an unusual, it's a relatively large farm, but not an unusual size farm for a Midwestern row crop farm. And I think it's important here to know what we always told the farmers at Top Farmer Workshop is that when you're thinking about doing something new, it's cheaper to try it in the computer before you actually go out and buy the machines and try it in the field. So if it works in the computer, that doesn't mean it'll work in your field, but it does tell you something about what are the likely problems and benefits that you're going to run.
Sure. And so what were the results that you got back?
Well, basically, our hypothesis was supported that the use of the autonomous machines did make strip cropping substantially more profitable, so that the net return to the farmer was about 4 times higher with the autonomous strip cropping. And the conventional strip cropping was profitable in our analysis because we did this with 2022 prices, and those were relatively high grain prices historically, and so strip cropping was profitable, but not nearly as profitable as the autonomous strip crop. When we looked at the labor times required, so the human labor times required between the whole field conventional farming and the autonomous farming was only slightly lower because you have many more machines that need to be managed. And one of the big differences with strip cropping is the travel time from field to field, because you can't do all the crop operations all at one time. So if you were doing conventional whole field farming, you would have this field in corn, you would do all the planting at one time, and it would be done. If you have now corn and soybeans, well, you have to visit that field twice as many times. And even with the autonomous machines, right now the part on the road has to be done with a human operator. That we think that it's going to take some time before autonomous farm machines are going to be allowed on the road.
Sure. And you mentioned then that overall, though, the autonomous got you kind of the best returns. So if the labor time is kind of similar, like where are those returns coming from?
They mostly come from two places. One of them is that with strip cropping, there's good evidence that there are higher corn yields. And we looked at all the studies that have been done, and they suggest that, in an average year, you're looking at about 15% higher corn yield, which is potentially very significant. Now, you get a slight reduction in soybean yields because of shading, and the corn yields are higher because of light interception. The corn is taller, and so on the edge, it gets more light. The soybeans are shaded slightly. And we looked at how this is affected by the corn-soybean price ratios, and it basically holds over all of them. But when the corn price is relatively high, the benefits are bigger. The other part of the benefit is in the machine cost. And you need to note that we assume that the farmers own the machines in this case. And this has been the way that most smaller autonomous machines in agriculture have been handled. And those kinds of machines are relatively common in Europe, less common in the US. And so we didn't assume the kinds of subscription models that lots of the larger autonomous machines in North America have been marketed with. So the farmer owns the machines, they're smaller machines. The retrofitting cost is relatively modest. It's about $40,000 per machine. And so the overall machine cost is quite a bit less with the swarm robotics.
Okay. How close would you say we are to this being like a practical thing for the average farmer to do? I mean, you said you've been doing this looks like it's like year 8 or something like that. So getting close to a decade, like, is this within reach of the average Midwest farmer, or like what are the obstacles to that, if not yet?
So technically, this is clearly within reach. We've been doing it at Harper Adams for many, many years. There's some other places in the world where this is being introduced. There's many companies. There's something like 350 companies around the world that are developing autonomous machines for crop production. The large manufacturers are introducing their own autonomous machines. What this study assumes is that the production of the small robots, the swarm robots, would achieve mass production and minimum cost level. So if you're producing 1 or a 5 or 10 of anything, they're going to be high priced. But if you're producing thousands and millions of them, then okay, the price goes down. And this would only work if there's mass production of these kinds of robots that were fit. And there's nothing engineering-wise that would stop that from happening. There is a business model issue there of how they're sold, and do they include the subscriptions that are used by some manufacturers? Does the farmer own these? Is it an Uber-style model where the companies are providing robots as a service? That's another possibility that's out there. We don't know what the answers to that are. So really, the engineering is quite advanced here. We can do this, but we need some entrepreneurs to come in and help us better work out what the business model will be. And they're working on this right now as we speak, but that process is not yet complete.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. One of the things that is always interesting to me whenever we're talking about certainly farming, but also economics specifically, is that, as per your modeling, there are so many factors that you can change. I know, we have some kind of future research that you're going to talk about here soon that talks about some of those factors. But so what are some of the things that would make this a bad choice for a farmer? Like we mentioned, like if the grain prices are right, if the grain prices are bad, is it not worth it? If it, like what are some of the factors that if a farmer is trying to look into whether this is feasible at their farm, like what should they be paying the closest attention to? Sorry, that was a very kind of a weird way to get to my question, but hopefully that was coherent enough.
So beyond the question of availability of the machines, and those machines are not quite yet available on the market anywhere in the world. But say you had the machines available. The other part of it is we don't know what the optimal agronomic decisions are. So the hybrids and varieties that you plant in corn and soybean fields, especially, there's been lots and lots of research on that. And many companies focus on optimizing those genetics. We know about the weed control. We know about how to manage the fertilizer, and we've been doing a better job with all kinds of variable rate technology and so on in recent years. But with strip cropping, we don't know what the optimal is, because what happens is, because you have more than one crop in the field, those crops interact. Does the corn benefit from having the soybean next to it that's fixing nitrogen? Does it affect how corn rootworm overwinters if you have strips next to each other? Does it affect plant diseases, tar spot in corn and other plant diseases in soybeans? So we don't know what that is yet, and that all needs to be worked out to make this an even better system.
Awesome. Yeah, you nailed exactly what my weird meandering question was trying to get at. So thank you for interpreting that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's exciting to me about this research, is that there is such a bounty of additional questions to seek out, and it really feels kind of like this nascent field that is opening up with a lot of opportunity. I mean, obviously 4 times return is huge, and that's just even when we haven't optimized it fully. So I think that leads super well into my next question for you, which is, where is the future research going? What more do we need to learn?
Well, I can tell you about the kinds of work that we're doing. So one part of that work is use of drones for agricultural input, particularly for spraying. And you think of drones are just robots in the sky. They're flying robots. And so many of the same issues apply. And you can use drones in swarms, and that's recently been allowed by the U.S. government. So that's actually legal in the U.S. And so we're looking at that. We recently did a study on steep hillside vineyards in Greece, and what would be the benefits and the cost of doing it there. But there's a whole set of issues in the U.S. and in North America on the advantages and disadvantages of that. There's also a set of questions around the large-scale autonomous machines, which are being introduced in North America, in the U.S. and Canada, by a number of the major manufacturers. What would be the benefits and the costs of doing that? And so that's not particularly well understood, but there's some work going on at Purdue that addresses that. And then there's the question of the multiple objective analysis. So, and in Europe, this has received a lot of attention, so that if you have better soil health because having several different crops in the field, what's the benefit of that? If you need less herbicide because the plants are healthier and the insects are being more naturally controlled, what are the public benefits of that? So including that in the analysis is something that's very important. And then there's another stream of work that's looking at electrically powered autonomous machines. And so as we go forward in the future, probably more things will be electric from some source of electric power, whether that's nuclear or something else. And electric power doesn't work well for large machines, because with current technology, the batteries, the amount of energy in a battery just becomes too heavy to work. But for small machines, it actually works relatively well. And so could we imagine small electrically powered robots, swarms of electrically powered robots that would produce crops effectively? So there, again, there's another set of machines, a set of options that need to be explored.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, clearly a huge area, lots of opportunities for future research. This has been an awesome conversation. I'm sure I could just bend your ear to ask question after question, but I will restrain myself for the sake of you and our listeners. and move into our final 3 questions. So the first one is, if listeners want to learn more about any of the things that we've talked about today, where can they go?
So one of the places that they can go is the Hands-Free Farm website, and make sure and specify the UK version of that. That tells a little bit about what we've been doing at Harper Adams. There's a number of scientific journals, particularly the Journal of Precision Agriculture, that publishes studies in this area. And then there are a number of there's the World Forum on Agricultural Robotics that regularly holds events where they provide demonstrations of these machines. So there's a lot of information out there.
Sure. Yeah, we will include links to those in our show notes, so be sure to check that out. Also, if people want more details on this research, we'll have a link to the paper in the show notes. And then if people want to take the next step and get involved, whether that's like as a researcher or a farmer that wants to kind of look into this, what would be kind of the first steps to get involved with this a little bit more?
So being associated with, right now, this is somewhat in the research and development arena. So being aware of what's happening at your local land-grant university in the U.S. or agricultural university elsewhere, what's happening with local startup businesses, because there's robotics businesses in most states in the United States, and being aware of what's going on, looking at what those potentials are. And we're to the stage where, yes, the first stage of this is looking at it in the model, testing it in the computer, but we're to the stage where some of these things are being tested in the field. This is increasingly common in Europe, particularly with weeding robots. There's some testing going on in the United States. And so if you're in contact with the people who are working in this area, whether in research or in business development, you would be in a good position to be involved in that one way or the other.
Awesome. Thank you. That's great advice for those looking to be on this particular cutting edge. So then, last question is, what is one fun fact that listeners wouldn't know about you if all they had was your research?
Well, even though I spend most of my working time focusing on robotics and high tech, one of the things that I really love to do is gardening and getting my hands in the dirt. So that can't be, at this point at least, replaced with a robot. And so I'll continue to do that.
Good. Wonderful. What do you grow in your garden?
I focus on vegetables. We try to have vegetables directly from the garden from the end of March to the beginning of January.
Wow. That's very much close to all year round. Wonderful. Well, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for all of your research.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. More information can be found in the description below. Thank you.